My name is Frank Miller, and at 68 years old, I believed I understood the shape of my life. It was a quiet life lived in the echo of a great love filled with the scent of sawdust and the satisfaction of a well-made joint. But that evening, at my son's dinner party, my daughter-in-law pointed a manicured finger at me and called for building security. "Get this pauper away from the table," she hissed, her voice cutting through the polite chatter. My own son David, a man whose college education was paid for by the splinters under my fingernails, just stood there, his face a mask of shame and silence. They saw my simple clothes and my calloused hands and assumed I was powerless. They mistook my grief for weakness, my quiet life for an empty one. They had no idea that for the last 6 months, since my best friend and business partner John passed away, I had silently inherited his 60% share of Starlight Designs, the very company that paid my daughter-in-law's 6-figure salary. As their security guard gently escorted me from the home I helped buy, I didn't feel rage. I felt a cold, clear focus. They had mistaken my patience for permission, and I was about to give them a masterclass in the difference. Before I continue this story, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. And please like this video and subscribe if you believe a person's worth is measured by their character, not their wallet. The call came on a Tuesday. I was in my workshop, the small garage I'd converted into a sanctuary of cedar and oak. The air was thick with the clean scent of freshly planed wood. My hands, though slower than they used to be, were steady as I worked a piece of cherry, coaxing a smooth curve from the stubborn grain. This was my peace. The quiet work. The predictable conversation between man and material. The phone's sharp ring was an intrusion, a sound from a world I mostly tried to keep at a distance. I wiped my hands on a rag and checked the screen. David. A knot I hadn't realized was there tightened in my stomach. We didn't talk much these days. My calls often went to voicemail, answered hours later with a text that felt like an automated reply. I answered. "Hey, Dad?" His voice had that smooth, practiced warmth he used for clients. It was the voice of a man selling something. "David, everything okay?" Yeah, everything's great. Listen, Vanessa and I are having a few people over on Saturday. A dinner. It's kind of important." I could hear the hesitation, the careful selection of words. I leaned against my workbench. The cherry wood was cool against my back. Important how? Well, Vanessa's boss, Mr. Peterson, is going to be there. It's a big deal for her, a chance to really impress him. I stayed silent. I knew what was coming next. "We'd really like you to be there, Dad. It would mean a lot." I looked around my workshop. At the worn handles of my chisels, the neat rows of hand planes, the framed photo of my late wife, Sarah, smiling from the workbench. Her eyes in the photo seemed to hold a gentle warning. Then I thought of the last time I'd been to their house for my grandson's birthday. I'd spent the whole evening on a patio chair watching David and Vanessa network, while my grandson stared at a new tablet. I had felt less like a grandfather, and more like a piece of furniture they had forgotten to put in storage. "Dad, you there?" "I'm here." "I don't know, son. These things aren't really my scene anymore." "It's just dinner, Dad. Please, just try to dress up a little, okay?" There it was. The real request hidden under the polite one. Don't be you. Be a version of you that doesn't embarrass us. I could hear Vanessa in the background, a high, sweet murmur. Tell him it's important for us to look like a family. David cleared his throat. Vanessa says it's important we all look like a family. His words were a parrot's devoid of his own conviction. A lifetime of my sacrifices flashed through my mind. Selling the 10 acres my father left me so David could get his MBA without debt. Working weekends for 2 years to give him the seed money for his first failed startup, a loss I never once threw in his face. I did it because he was my son. Because I believed that giving him a better start meant he would become a better man. The silence stretched. "Okay," I said finally, the word tasting like sawdust. "I'll be there." "Great, Dad. That's great. Just be yourself. You know your best self." He hung up before I could ask him what my worst self looked like. I set the phone down and picked up my handplane. My best self, I thought, was the man who built things. The man they had long ago decided wasn't worth showing off. I chose my clothes with care. Not to impress them, but to honor myself. A clean, pressed flannel shirt, my best pair of khaki pants, and the leather boots I'd had for 20 years, oiled and polished until they shone with a quiet dignity. When I arrived, the valet at their condo building looked at my 10-year-old Ford with a professional pity that told me I was already out of place. Their apartment was on the 12th floor, with a view that stretched across the city lights like a carpet of diamonds. The air inside was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and catered food. It was a beautiful performance of success. Vanessa greeted me with a kiss on the cheek that didn't quite land, her eyes flicking over my shirt, with a micro-expression of disappointment. "Dad, you made it," she said, her smile as bright and hard as the marble countertops in her kitchen. She introduced me to a few people with a practiced vagueness. "This is David's father, Frank." She never mentioned what I did, what I had spent my life building. To them, I was just a prefix, David's father. The evening wore on. I stood by the window, a glass of club soda in my hand, feeling like a ghost at a feast. David was holding court by the fireplace, telling a story about a recent business trip to Singapore. His listeners laughed at all the right moments. They were his people, people who understood the language of stock options and capital gains. I watched him and felt a familiar hollow ache. He had the life I had wanted for him. What I hadn't realized was that in his new life there was no room for the man who had built the ladder he'd climbed. The breaking point, when it came, was quiet. We were seated for dinner around a long, polished mahogany table. Mr. Peterson, Vanessa's boss, a man with a soft voice and intelligent eyes, was admiring the table itself. "This is a magnificent piece," he said, running a hand over the smooth finish. "Italian, I presume?" Vanessa beamed, preening under his praise. "It is. We had it imported." I knew that table. I recognized the grain, the subtle bird's-eye pattern in the wood. It wasn't Italian. It was American black walnut, a notoriously difficult wood to work with. And I knew the joinery. I had seen it before in a small workshop in Vermont years ago. Without thinking, the craftsman in me spoke up. "It's a beautiful piece," I said quietly, my voice entering the conversation for the first time. "American walnut, though. You can tell by the way the grain shifts near the joints. A Vermont craftsman, I believe. He has a very distinctive way of handling his dovetails." The table went silent. Mr. Peterson leaned forward, intrigued. "Really, how can you tell?" Before I could answer, Vanessa's laugh cut through the air. It was a high, brittle sound. "Oh, Dad," she said, her voice dripping with condescending sweetness. "Always the carpenter. He sees wood and forgets his manners." Then she turned to her husband. Her smile was gone, replaced by a tight, angry line. "David," she said, her voice low but carrying across the table, "can you please call security?" David froze his fork halfway to his mouth. "What, why?" Vanessa didn't look at me. She kept her eyes on David, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper that everyone could hear. "Because I would like this pauper removed from my table. He's embarrassing our guests." The word hung in the air. Pauper. The silence that followed was absolute. Mr. Peterson looked down at his plate, a flush creeping up his neck. The other guests stared at their water glasses, at the ceiling, anywhere but at me. I looked at my son. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a familiar, helpless panic. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He did nothing. He said nothing. He just sat there, a guest, at his own wife's cruelty. I slowly, carefully placed my napkin beside my plate. I stood up. My chair made no sound on the thick rug. I looked at Vanessa, whose face was a mask of cold triumph. I looked at David, who refused to meet my eyes. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. My silence was its own verdict. I turned and walked out of the dining room, my footsteps the only sound in a room full of people who had chosen not to hear. As I reached the front door, I heard Vanessa's whisper, sharp and victorious, "Follow me into the hall." See, problem solved. The 2-hour drive back to my side of Phoenix was a silent one. The city lights of Scottsdale receded in my rearview mirror, a glittering, indifferent constellation. The sting of Vanessa's words, the heavier weight of David's silence began to fade. It wasn't that the wound was healing. It was simply turning into something else. A scar, hard, numb, and permanent. By the time I pulled into the driveway of my small, paid-off brick house, the hurt had given way to a strange and unfamiliar calm. It was the quiet clarity a man finds after a fever breaks. I wasn't heartbroken anymore. I was simply finished. The house was cool and dark, smelling faintly of sawdust and the lemon polish my wife Sarah used to love. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't pour a drink. I walked past the living room, past the worn armchair where I read the paper every morning, and went straight to my study. It wasn't much of a room, more of a converted den, but it was mine. The walls were lined with books on woodworking and history. On the desk, a single photograph of Sarah taken on the shore of Lake Powell, her smile wider than the canyon behind her. Against the far wall beneath the window sat an old cedar chest. John had built it for me as a wedding gift nearly 45 years ago. The dovetail joints were so perfect, you couldn't slip a piece of paper between them. I knelt down the floorboards, creaking a familiar complaint, and lifted the heavy lid. The scent of old cedar and paper rose up to meet me, a smell like memory itself. This wasn't a place of grief. It was a place of record. My fingers brushed past bundles of old letters and Sarah's recipe cards until they found what they were looking for. A heavy accordion-style folder tied with a faded ribbon. Inside were the artifacts of a friendship that had defined my life. There was a black and white photograph, the corners soft from handling, of two young men in their 20s, covered in sawdust, grinning like fools in front of a half-finished workshop. Me and John. We had nothing back then but a shared dream and a belief that good wood handled with respect would never lie to you. Beneath the photo was a cocktail napkin from a bar that had been torn down decades ago. On it, in John's sprawling handwriting, was the first contract for our partnership, Miller and Hayes Custom Woodwork. We'd signed it with a borrowed pen, two dreamers thinking we could build a world out of oak and sweat. We did for a while. But John was the visionary, the one with the head for business. I was the craftsman, the one who understood the wood. He went on to build Starlight Designs into an empire of taste and precision, while I stayed with the work of my hands, running my own small contracting business. We never lost touch. Our friendship was the one joint that never came loose. I lifted the last item from the folder. A thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with wax. It had arrived by courier 6 months ago, a week after John's funeral. My hands were steady as I broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. John's handwriting was weaker now, the letters leaning on each other for support, but the voice was unmistakably his. "Frank," it began, "if you're reading this, then I'm off building something in a workshop with better lighting. I've left the business of this world behind, and some of it now falls to you. Starlight Designs was our dream, even if my name was the only one on the door. You were its foundation. You taught me the meaning of integrity, of a line drawn true. And that is why I've done this. My lawyers have the paperwork. My shares, all 60% of them, are now yours. You are the majority shareholder, Frank. The chairman of the board, if you want the title. I know you never wanted the corner office, but the company needs a conscience more than it needs another salesman. It needs a moral compass. And you, my friend, have a compass that this world has lost. Do what you see fit. Protect what we built. Protect the good people. I trust you." I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. For 6 months, I had done nothing. Out of grief for my friend, out of a quiet reluctance to step into a world I didn't feel I belonged to. I had let the shares sit an abstract fact in a lawyer's file while I tended to my own quiet life. But tonight, standing in my son's opulent living room, being dismissed like a piece of inconvenient furniture, something had shifted. John hadn't just left me a company. He had left me a responsibility. He had left me a set of tools. My eyes fell on a worn business card tucked into a side pocket of the folder. George Finney, Chief Financial Officer, Starlight Designs. George had been with John from the beginning. A quiet, decent man who understood that numbers like wood have a grain. If you force them against it, they splinter. I picked up the phone. My heart was a steady, even drum. I wasn't the pauper from the dinner party anymore. I was a man with a moral compass, and I was finally ready to find north. I dialed the number. It rang 3 times. Finney. His voice was tired, the sound of a man who had worked too late. George, I said, my own voice calm and clear. This is Frank Miller. John Hayes was a friend of mine. He left me a few things. I think it's time we talked. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Not of confusion, but of something else. It was the sound of a man exhaling a breath he had been holding for a very long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with an unmistakable, weary relief. Frank, he said, my God, I am so glad you called. George Finney suggested a diner on the outskirts of town, a place with cracked red vinyl booths and a clock on the wall that had been telling the same slow time for 40 years. It was the kind of place where conversations could happen without an audience. He was already there when I arrived, a half-empty coffee cup in front of him, a stack of papers in a neat folder by his elbow. He looked older than I remembered, the lines around his eyes deeper, but the steady calm was still there. It was the calm of a man who had seen markets rise and fall, and knew that the only real asset was your own integrity. She's a rising star, George said, after the waitress had refilled his cup and left us to our quiet corner. Vanessa, I mean. John saw her talent early on. He also saw the ambition. George chose the word carefully, the way a man handles a tool that is both useful and dangerous. He worried it wasn't anchored to anything. It's anchored to my son, I said, and my son is anchored to her. George nodded slowly, understanding the geometry of it. What do you need, Frank? I didn't want to say the words revenge or punishment. They felt too loud, too clumsy for what I was building. I need to understand the company John left me, I said, and I want to start with her department. I want to see everything, George. Every project, every expense report, every line item. I want to know what she's building with my friend's legacy. He didn't ask why. He didn't need to. He simply slid the folder across the table. I anticipated you might ask. This is the current departmental overview, but paper only tells you part of the story. If you want to see how she operates under pressure, there's a cleaner way. He took a sip of his coffee. A surprise audit. It's a standard procedure perfectly justifiable before the end of the quarter. The official reason will be cost optimization. The real reason is that it will allow us to look into every corner without her knowing who sent us. Do it, I said. The words were quiet, but they felt like the heaviest thing I had lifted all year. Vanessa felt the glow of the dinner party for 2 full days. In her mind, the evening had been a resounding success. Mr. Peterson had been impressed, the clients were charmed, and the small, inconvenient matter of her father-in-law had been handled with swift, clean efficiency. She walked into the Starlight Designs office on Wednesday morning, feeling invincible. Her presentation on the Monarch Hotel Group project was scheduled for that afternoon, and she knew it was flawless. This project was her masterpiece, a multi-million-dollar contract to redesign the lobbies of a boutique hotel chain. It was her ticket to a senior partnership, to the next level of a world that finally saw her the way she saw herself. She was standing in the glass-walled conference room, pointing to a rendering of a marble staircase on the projector screen when the email landed. It arrived without ceremony, a bland subject line from the CFO's office, Notice of Departmental Audit. She read it once, then again. A flicker of annoyance, but not fear. This had to be Mark from commercial projects. He'd been jealous of the Monarch account for months, always making little digs in meetings. This was his move, a petty attempt to slow her down to make her look disorganized. It was pathetic. It was also a challenge. That evening, she stayed late. The cleaning crew moved around her, the scent of their industrial lemon cleaner filling the empty office. She sat under the harsh fluorescent lights, her desk covered in spreadsheets and invoices, cross-referencing every number, checking every receipt. She would not give Mark the satisfaction of finding a single misplaced comma. The pressure was a familiar fuel. She worked best when she had an enemy to outperform. She called David on her drive home, the Bluetooth in her car, making her voice sound crisp and metallic. "You won't believe what Mark is trying to pull," she vented. "A full audit 2 weeks before the quarterly reports are due. It's a transparent power play." David's voice on the other end was placating, tired. "Just be careful, Ness. Don't give him anything to use against you." He didn't understand. This wasn't about being careful. It was about winning. The audit made her sharper, more focused. She became suspicious of her own assistants, double-checking their work with a new icy precision. The atmosphere in her department grew tense. Laughter in the break room quieted when she walked in. She was a general preparing for a battle only she could see, and she had no idea the attack was coming from a direction she had never thought to guard. The audit finished on Friday. George called me that afternoon. "It's clean," he said. "Annoyingly so. A few padded expense reports for client lunches, but nothing that would raise a flag. She's careful." "I know," I said. "That's not what this was for." "I understand," George replied. And it worked. I now have a complete manifest of everything in her department. Every project, every vendor, every deadline. He paused. "Frank, we know where the main support beam is. It's the Monarch Hotel project. It's her entire future. If that beam cracks, the whole structure she's built for herself comes down." I looked out my workshop window at the cedar chest John had made me, a structure built to last. "Thank you, George," I said. "Now we wait for the right moment to test the foundation." The audit was a quiet prelude, a ripple on the water's surface that hinted at the current below. Vanessa had weathered it, convinced it was the work of a jealous rival. She had no idea the tide itself was turning against her. For the next few days, I let the silence do its work. I tended to the small garden Sarah had planted, my hands finding a familiar peace in the soil. I took my time at the grocery store. I read a book on the porch as the autumn evenings grew cooler. I was a man living a small, predictable life. And all the while the manifest George had given me sat on my desk, a detailed blueprint of my daughter-in-law's professional world. On Friday, I called George again. We didn't meet at the diner this time. A phone call was enough. It was a call to make a cut, and a craftsman knows you don't need an audience for that. "George," I said, my voice even. "The Monarch Hotel project. As the representative for the majority shareholder, I want you to put it on indefinite hold." George didn't ask for a reason. He understood the tool I was using. "What should I tell Peterson?" he asked. "Tell him the new ownership is conducting a top-down strategic review of all major capital projects. Tell him it's nothing personal. It's just business." "It will hit her hard, Frank." "I know," I said, and the simple truth of it settled in my chest, cold and heavy. That's the point. The news reached Vanessa not as a thunderclap, but as a quiet professional email. A carbon copy from Mr. Peterson's office. Subject, Project Hold, Monarch Hotel Group. She was in a meeting presenting minor budget adjustments when her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, her confident smile faltering for just a fraction of a second. She excused herself, her voice a little too tight, and stepped into the hallway. This time, it wasn't annoyance. It was pure, cold panic. The Monarch Project wasn't just another account. It was her coronation. It was the win that would make her untouchable, the one that would finally erase the last traces of the middle-class life she despised. To have it frozen without reason, without warning, was a fatal blow. She tried to get answers. She called Mr. Peterson, who was just as bewildered and angry. He'd been stonewalled by the CFO's office. "It's this new mystery shareholder," he fumed. "No one knows who he is, but he's got the board spooked." She tried George's office, but his assistant was a polite fortress of corporate policy. "Mr. Finney is in meetings." The corporate rival theory no longer made sense. This was a move of absolute power, a ghost in the machine pulling the most important levers. That night, the careful performance of their domestic life shattered. The pressure that had been building inside Vanessa finally erupted. "Someone is trying to destroy me, David," she screamed, throwing a stack of design magazines onto the floor. "This isn't just a setback, this is an execution, and you're just sitting there." David, useless in the face of a problem he couldn't solve, with a charming smile, could only stammer. "What do you want me to do, Ness? I don't know who it is." He felt the familiar weight of his own inadequacy, a feeling he'd spent his entire adult life trying to outrun. And in that moment of desperation, his mind made a desperate leap. It was a guess born from a deep, unacknowledged shame. "Maybe," he said slowly, "maybe it's my dad." Vanessa stopped pacing. She stared at him. "Your father." "The carpenter, don't be ridiculous. What could he possibly do?" "I don't know." David said, the idea taking root. "But he was a contractor for 30 years. He knows people. And after that dinner, he was angry. Maybe he called in some old favor, complained to someone on a zoning board, I don't know. Something to cause a problem." It was a preposterous idea. A retired woodworker derailing a multi-million-dollar corporate project. But it was the only theory that gave Vanessa a face to put on her phantom enemy. The old man, the pauper, the inconvenient, embarrassing relic who had dared to correct her in front of her boss. It made a perverse kind of sense. He was bitter, he was resentful, and he was trying to ruin her. David watched the calculation in her eyes. He had offered her a target, and she had taken it. Her panic began to reshape itself into a cold, focused rage. She looked at David, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous hum. "Get your coat," she said. "We're going to pay your father a visit. It's time we reminded that old man exactly who he is dealing with." The sound of their BMW crunching on my gravel driveway was an insult in itself. It was too loud, too aggressive for the quiet street where I had lived for 40 years. I was in my living room, wiping down the mantelpiece where a picture of Sarah still sat, her smile catching the afternoon light. I didn't move to the door. I let them knock. They entered as if they owned the space, bringing a gust of cold air and entitlement with them. David looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting around the small, neat room as if he were a stranger. Vanessa, however, was a predator in her element. She didn't bother with a greeting. Her expensive heels clicked on the hardwood floor with an impatient rhythm. "This little game of yours is over, Frank," she said, her voice sharp and polished. "We know you're behind this." She dropped her designer handbag onto the armchair, where Sarah used to knit, a casual act of territorial marking. I finished wiping the frame of the photograph before turning to face them. I kept my voice low and even. "I don't know what game you're talking about, Vanessa." David stepped forward, playing his role as the reluctant mediator. "Dad, please," he said, his tone pleading. "Just stop. Whatever you did, whoever you called, just undo it. This isn't necessary." "Unnecessary?" Vanessa let out a short, humorless laugh. "He's trying to sabotage my career, David, and you're asking him to be nice about it." She turned her full attention to me, her eyes narrowed. I don't know who you think you are, but you pulled some strings. You called in some old-timer favor from your construction days and had my project frozen. I want you to call it off. Now. I let her words settle in the quiet room. I could hear the steady tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound they had long ago tuned out. I looked from her furious face to my son's anxious one. I didn't admit anything. I didn't deny it either. I simply sat down in my armchair, the one with the worn arms that knew the shape of my body, and asked a simple question. Why would I do that? Vanessa was ready for that. She had rehearsed her list of my supposed sins. Why? She scoffed. Because you're bitter, Frank. Because you were embarrassed at dinner and you can't stand that we've built a life you could only dream of. You're jealous, and you're trying to punish us for not needing you anymore. I let her finish. I took a slow breath. I'm not bitter, Vanessa, I said, my voice as calm as the surface of a deep lake. I'm disappointed. I looked past her to my son. A father has a right to be disappointed when his son, the man he raised, stands by and watches his wife call a security guard to have him thrown out of their home. Then I turned my eyes back to her. And a craftsman, I said, letting the word hang in the air, the one she'd used as an insult, has a right to be disappointed when his daughter-in-law, a professional designer, can't tell the difference between American black walnut and a cheap Italian veneer. Her face flushed a dark, angry red. David winced as if the words had physically struck him. I wasn't finished. You talk about your life, the one you've built. Who do you think laid the foundation? I sold the 10 acres my father left me, the only land our family had, so David could get his MBA without a penny of debt. When his first tech venture failed, I emptied my retirement account to cover his losses so his credit wouldn't be ruined. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke the words like a man reading from a ledger, each sacrifice a clean, undeniable line item. Those weren't investments, Vanessa. I never asked for a return. They were gifts. And the only thing I ever hoped for in return was a little respect. Not a standing ovation. Just the basic decency of not being treated like a pauper at my own son's dinner table. They were silent. My words had dismantled the simple story they had told themselves, the one where they were the self-made heroes, and I was the burdensome, resentful old man. They had come here expecting a fight, a shouting match with a weak man they could easily overwhelm. They found a judge instead, a quiet authority they didn't know how to argue against. Vanessa recovered first, her anger reassembling itself around her wounded pride. This changes nothing, she said, her voice trembling slightly. There's a board meeting next week to introduce the new leadership. I will present my project, and I will win them over. You can't stop that. I just looked at her. I didn't need to say anything. I could see the path she had chosen. She couldn't conceive of a power she couldn't see, couldn't flatter, couldn't manipulate. Her ambition was a blindfold, and she was walking straight into the trap I had set. David looked from me to his wife, his face a mess of confusion and dawning guilt. Ness, maybe we should just go, he said quietly. But she was already moving toward the door, her confidence a brittle shield. They left without another word. I watched through the window as they got into their expensive car, their movements stiff and angry. They were still in control, they told themselves. They were still the ones driving. I stayed in my armchair long after their car disappeared down the street. The house was quiet again, but this time the quiet didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like strategy. Vanessa was right about one thing. The board meeting was her only chance. She would prepare for it obsessively. She would pour all of her talent and ambition into a single presentation, desperate to impress the new faceless chairman. She had no idea she would be making her case directly to the pauper she'd had thrown out of dinner. The confrontation at my house left them shaken, but I knew Vanessa well enough to predict her next move. A cornered animal doesn't learn humility. It looks for a new way to attack. She couldn't accept a power she couldn't see, so she would double down on the only power she believed in: her own performance. It was time to give her a stage. I called George the next morning. My instructions were simple. "George," I said, "it's time to announce the future of the company. Schedule a mandatory all-hands town hall meeting for next Friday." "The topic?" he asked, though I could hear in his voice that he already knew the answer. "A new strategic vision," I said, "and an introduction to the new leadership." I paused, letting the weight of the next words settle. "And add a special item to the agenda. A presentation of key strategic projects for final approval from the new chairman." George was silent for a beat. "She'll see that as her only way out," he said. "She'll take the bait." "I know," I said. "That's why we're offering it." The email went out an hour later. It landed in Vanessa's inbox like a divine intervention. For weeks she had been fighting a ghost, a nameless, faceless power that had stalled her career. Now that power was giving her an opportunity, a spotlight. The new mysterious chairman was finally revealing himself, and he was giving her a chance to plead her case. In her mind, the narrative was clear. The project hold was a test. The audit was a test. And this meeting was her final exam. If she could deliver a brilliant presentation, if she could dazzle this new chairman with her vision and competence, she could reclaim everything. Her career, her status, her control. Her fear and paranoia evaporated, replaced by a surge of adrenaline and obsessive focus. The world outside of her Monarch Hotel project ceased to exist. She canceled dinner plans with friends. She arrived at the office before sunrise and left long after the city lights had come on. Her team was subjected to relentless rehearsals. Every slide of the presentation scrutinized, every word of her speech memorized and polished. She was crafting the performance of her life. David told me later she was a woman possessed, her eyes bright with a manic energy. He said she talked in her sleep about profit margins and design aesthetics. She was so convinced that her talent was the key to unlocking this puzzle that she never once stopped to ask who had built the door. I, on the other hand, spent the week quietly. I visited Sarah's grave, leaving a small, simple bouquet of wildflowers. I spent an afternoon in my workshop sanding a piece of old walnut until the grain felt like silk under my palm. I watched the autumn leaves fall, each one letting go without a fight. I was not preparing for a battle. I was preparing for a correction. George called me on Thursday evening. "The stage is set, Frank," he said. "She's ready. She thinks she's about to give the speech that saves her career." "Good," I said, looking out at the calm, dark water of the lake. "Let her." The date was set. The trap was baited. And the lead actress was busy rehearsing for a final act she had no idea I had already written, while Vanessa was sharpening her ambition into a weapon. I was finding my peace in the quiet places. I didn't need to prepare a speech. The truth doesn't require rehearsal. It only requires a man willing to stand behind it. The week leading up to the Friday meeting was for me a series of small, necessary rituals. On Wednesday, I drove out to the cemetery. The sky was a high, clean blue, and the autumn air was so crisp it felt like breathing in cold water. I stood before Sarah's grave, a simple granite headstone that read Sarah Miller, a life lived with grace. I replaced the faded flowers in the small vase with a handful of wild asters I'd picked from the edge of the woods. I didn't speak to her out loud. I never did. But I stood there and told her everything in the quiet space of my own mind. I told her about the dinner, about the word pauper, about David's silence. I told her about John's letter and the weight of the responsibility he had left me. I told her I was afraid not of them, but of becoming a man she wouldn't recognize in my pursuit of setting things right. "I think you'd understand, Sarah," I thought. "You always knew the difference between a fight and a correction." I stayed until the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grass, feeling the cool stone under my fingertips. When I left, a sense of calm had settled in my bones. I wasn't just fighting for a company. I was defending the life we had built, the values we had shared. The next day, I spent the entire morning in my workshop. I took a rough-sawn piece of black walnut, the same wood as their pretentious dining table, and set it on my workbench. I didn't have a project in mind. I just needed to feel the conversation between my hands and the wood. I started with a hand plane, the rhythmic shh of the blade shaving away the rough exterior. Hours passed. The pile of fragrant curly shavings grew around my feet. I moved from the plane to the sandpaper, starting with a coarse grit and working my way down, feeling the grain slowly surrender its roughness, becoming smoother, more honest. The work was meditative. It was a way of taking something chaotic and, through patient, steady effort, bringing it to a state of undeniable truth. By the time I finished, the piece of wood was as smooth as riverstone, its deep, complex grain glowing under the workshop lights. It was just a piece of wood, but it felt like I had restored some small piece of order to the world. That evening, with the scent of walnuts still on my hands, I picked up the phone and called David. He answered on the second ring, his voice wary. "Dad." "David," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "There's a company meeting at Starlight Designs tomorrow, a town hall. I want you to be there." There was a pause. "Why, what's it got to do with me?" "You're my son," I said simply. "Your family. I want you there as family." He hesitated. I could hear the gears turning in his head, the mix of curiosity, guilt, and a son's ingrained reluctant duty. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay, Dad. I'll be there." I didn't thank him. I just said, "Good," and ended the call. He needed to be there. He needed to see the full and final consequence of the choices he had made and the choices he had failed to make. Before I turned in for the night, I stood in my study and looked at the old black and white photograph of me and John. Two young men full of sawdust and impossible dreams. We had built our first workshop with salvaged lumber and second-hand tools, and we had thought we were the richest men in the world. He had chased the dream into boardrooms and skyscrapers. I had kept my hands on the wood, but the foundation was the same. It was built on a handshake, on a shared belief that you do right by the people you work with, and you never ever lie about the quality of the material. "I'll do right by this, John," I whispered to the smiling young man in the photograph. "For both of us." I turned off the light. The house was quiet. The preparations were complete. Tomorrow, the talking would finally be over. It was time to show them what a foundation built to last really looks like. The conference room at Starlight Designs was a world away from my workshop. It was a cathedral of glass and steel, with a long, polished obsidian table that reflected the city skyline like a dark, still lake. The air conditioning hummed a low, constant note, and the room smelled of money, a sterile, metallic scent that was nothing like the honest smell of wood. I watched it all from a small office on a monitor George had set up for me. It was better this way. I didn't want to be a presence in the room. I wanted to be a consequence. The employees filed in, their faces a mixture of curiosity and anxiety. They wore the uniform of the corporate world, sharp suits, elegant dresses, the quiet confidence of people who knew their value was measured in quarterly reports. I saw David come in and take a seat in the front row designated for guests. He looked nervous, constantly adjusting his tie, his eyes scanning the room as if he were looking for an exit. He was a guest in a world he desperately wanted to own. Then Vanessa walked onto the stage. She was radiant. She wore a tailored white suit that stood out like a beacon against the room's dark wood and charcoal gray upholstery. Her confidence was a physical thing. It filled the space around her. She smiled at the audience, a warm, practiced smile that promised success. She was in her element, the star of a show she had directed and produced. She believed with every fiber of her being that she was about to win. Her presentation was, I had to admit, brilliant. She spoke with a fluid, easy authority. The renderings for the Monarch Hotel project were stunning, elegant, modern, yet timeless. She walked the audience through every detail from the custom-milled woodwork to the bespoke lighting fixtures. She spoke their language, the language of luxury, of brand identity, of a client's vision made manifest. She was talented. I had never denied that. But talent without character is like a beautiful house built on a rotten foundation. It's only a matter of time before it collapses. When she finished, the room erupted in applause. It was genuine. She had dazzled them. She stood in the warm glow of the stage lights, accepting their admiration, her smile triumphant. She had done it. She had saved herself. Then George Finney walked onto the stage. He was a calm, steady presence, his simple gray suit, a quiet counterpoint to Vanessa's brilliant white. He waited for the applause to die down. "Thank you, Vanessa," he said, his voice even and professional. "That was an exceptional presentation, truly." Vanessa inclined her head, a queen accepting the praise of a loyal subject. George continued, "As you all know, Starlight Designs has recently undergone a significant change in ownership, a change that brings us back to the foundational principles upon which this company was built." He paused, letting his eyes sweep across the room. "And so it is my distinct honor to introduce you to our new chairman of the board. He is the man who now holds a 60% controlling interest in this company. He was John Hayes's oldest and dearest friend, his first business partner, and in my professional opinion, one of the finest craftsmen I have ever had the privilege of knowing. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Frank Miller." I walked out from the wings. I wore the same simple flannel shirt and khaki pants I had worn to the dinner party. The silence in the room was absolute. It wasn't just a lack of noise. It was a physical presence, a heavy blanket that smothered the air. Every face was turned toward me. I saw confusion, disbelief. Then I looked at Vanessa. Her triumphant smile was frozen on her face. It was a relic from a moment ago, an artifact from a world that no longer existed. I watched her mind work behind her eyes, the frantic calculation as she tried to make sense of the impossible. The pauper. The inconvenient old carpenter. Her smile didn't just fade. It seemed to crack and fall away, revealing the raw, stark terror beneath. Her face went pale, a sickly, chalky white. Then I looked at David. His mouth was hanging open. His eyes were wide with a horror so profound, it was almost comical. He was staring at me as if he were seeing a ghost, the ghost of every sacrifice he had taken for granted, every warning he had ignored, every silent disappointment he had mistaken for acceptance. In that one shattering moment, he understood. He understood everything. I stepped up to the podium. I didn't look at my notes. I didn't have any. I looked out at the sea of stunned faces, and then my eyes settled on Vanessa. My voice when I spoke was not loud. It was calm. It was clear. "Vanessa," I began, "that was a brilliant presentation. You have a remarkable eye for design." I let the compliment land a small, unexpected kindness. She flinched as if I had struck her. "But a good designer," I continued, "understands the value of their materials. A great leader understands the value of people. In both areas you have shown a significant deficit." I paused, letting the weight of my words fill the silent room. "At a dinner party several weeks ago, in a home built on a foundation of my life's work, you asked a security guard to get this pauper away from the table." I held her gaze. She looked like she wanted to shrink, to disappear, but the stage lights held her in place. "Today in this boardroom," I said, my voice never wavering, "I am asking you to clear your desk." A collective gasp went through the room. Vanessa swayed slightly, her hand gripping the edge of the podium to steady herself. "However," I added, because the correction needed to be complete, "Starlight Designs is not without compassion. We have an opening in the company cafeteria for a dishwasher. The position requires a respect for what other people leave behind and a commitment to making things clean. Perhaps it's a place you can start." That was it. the invisible structure of her world collapsed. She didn't scream, she didn't faint. She simply folded. Her shoulders slumped, her head bowed, and a single dry sob escaped her lips. The sound was unnervingly loud in the dead quiet. The performance was over. Then David moved. He shot up from his seat and stumbled toward the stage. Not to defend her, not to attack me. He was a man running toward the epicenter of an earthquake, not knowing why. He stopped at the foot of the stage, his hand outstretched, his face a wreck of confusion and despair. "Dad," he stammered. "Dad, I didn't—" He couldn't finish a sentence. I looked down at my son. The anger I had carried for so long was gone, replaced by a deep, weary sadness. He wasn't a villain. He was just a weak man who had made a series of bad choices. "We'll talk later, David," I said, my voice softer now. "When you remember who you are." The chairman's office on the top floor of the Starlight building didn't stay a corner office for long. Within a week, I had George clear out the pretentious glass desk and the uncomfortable leather chairs that were designed for intimidation, not conversation. I brought in my old oak workbench from home. I set my handplanes in a neat row on the credenza. The air, which had once smelled of nothing but refrigerated air, now carried the faint, honest scent of cedar and wood polish. The blueprints spread across my workbench weren't for skyscrapers. They were for a rocking chair I was designing. I was running the company, but I was doing it my way. Vanessa, as I expected, did not take the job in the cafeteria. The day after the meeting, her desk was empty. Her name was removed from the company directory. She disappeared from the city, a ghost made of ambition and a broken narrative. I never heard from her again. About a month later, David came to see me. He didn't call first. He just appeared in the doorway of my new office workshop, looking thinner, tired, but with a clarity in his eyes I hadn't seen since he was a boy. The expensive suit was gone, replaced by a simple work shirt and jeans. He had quit his job. He didn't offer excuses or long explanations. He just stood there for a moment, taking in the scent of the wood. "I applied for a job," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "With a nonprofit. They build houses for low-income families. I start next week as an apprentice." He looked at his own hands, soft and uncalloused. "I want to learn how to build something real again. With my hands." I didn't get up. I didn't rush to embrace him. The chasm between us was too wide for a simple hug to cross. An easy forgiveness would have been a lie, and we had had enough of those. Instead, I nodded slowly. I reached for the piece of black walnut I had sanded the day before the meeting, the one that was as smooth and true as polished stone. I held it out to him. "Start with this," I said. "Feel it. Understand its grain, its weight, its honesty. When you understand the wood, you can come back, and we can talk about building a house." He took the piece of wood from my hand. He held it carefully, turning it over and over, his fingers tracing the lines I had made. And for the first time in 20 years, when he looked at me, he didn't see an obstacle, a resource, or a ghost from his past. He saw his father. Later that evening, long after David had left, I stood alone on the small balcony outside my new office. The city spread out below me, a vast, glittering tapestry of light and shadow. The sounds of traffic and sirens were a distant, muted hum. A cool breeze moved through the high-rise canyons, carrying with it the feeling of a world that was constantly moving, constantly changing. I didn't feel triumph. The bitter taste of revenge had long since faded, leaving something cleaner in its place. I didn't feel joy. The cost of this victory had been too high. What I felt was a deep, quiet, and unshakable peace. The correction was complete. Balance had been restored. The single greatest lesson from this story is that a man's dignity is non-negotiable. It is the bedrock upon which his life is built, and it cannot be signed away to keep the peace or to subsidize the comfort of others, not even family. When you allow your sacrifices to be treated as an entitlement, you are not being kind. You are teaching others that your self-respect is a resource they can spend. Establishing a boundary is not an act of war. It is an act of self-preservation. It is the moment a man decides that his silence will no longer be mistaken for permission. A boundary is not a wall meant to push people away forever. It is a door that teaches them, finally, how to knock with respect before entering your life. It is the quiet, irreversible act of taking back the key to your own house and deciding for yourself who is welcome inside. If you believe that a man's dignity is the most valuable thing he owns, please like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories about the rise of silent men.